So let's start with what is a clause. A clause is a group of words containing a subject and a verb, which form a sentence or part of a sentence. So an example could be, I can't cook very well, but I make quite good pancakes. I can't cook very well is a clause, and I make quite good pancakes is a clause too. They are main or independent clauses, that is, they are of equal importance and could each exist as a separate sentence, but we won't go into that today. Each clause has a subject, I, and a verb, here cook and make. Whereas a relative clause starts with a relative pronoun, either who, which, that, whose, where, when, whom, and why. For example, the man who called you is my dentist. The relative clause is who called you. There are two types of relative clause, defining and non-defining. So what is a defining relative clause? Defining relative clauses give us essential information that we need to understand what or who is being referred to. A defining relative clause usually comes immediately after the noun it describes. For example, the dentist who treated me is my uncle. The relative clause tells us which dentist we are talking about. It is essential information. If we removed the clause, we would not know which dentist we are talking about, and it comes immediately after the noun it describes, here the dentist. Whereas relative clauses that give us extra information are called non-defining relative clauses. For instance, my uncle is a dentist who plays at the same cricket club as you. We already know which dentist, it's my uncle, who plays at the same cricket club as you, does not tell us which dentist we are talking about. It just adds extra information. So what are the other differences between defining and non-defining relative clauses? First up, defining relative clauses are never separated from the rest of the sentence by commas. The dentist who treated me is my uncle has no commas, whereas non-defining relative clauses must be separated from the rest of the sentence by commas. My uncle is a dentist, comma, who plays at the same cricket club as you. Defining relative clauses and non-defining relative clauses may both begin with these relative pronouns. Who, for people. The woman who lives next door is a doctor. This is essential information. Without the relative clause, we would not know which woman we were talking about, so it's a defining relative clause. Whereas my brother Tim, who lives in Scotland, is a doctor, is a non-defining relative clause because it is simply adding extra information. Notice the two commas when it is in the middle of a sentence. Which, for things. Brian works for a company which makes computers. Here it is a defining relative clause. It is essential information, otherwise we do not know which company Brian works for. Whereas, Brian told me about his new job, comma, which he is not enjoying very much. This is adding extra information, so it's a non-defining relative clause. Notice the comma. Whose, instead of his, her, or their, we usually use whose as a relative pronoun to indicate possession by people and animals. So in a defining clause, we could say, we met some people whose car had broken down, essential information to know who we met, or in a non-defining clause, Sam, whose car had broken down, was in a bad mood. This is simply adding extra information, so it's a non-defining clause. Where, for places. In a defining clause, you could say, what is the name of the place where you went on holiday? This is essential information. Or, non-defining, Jane has just been to Oxford, where her dad lives. When, for times. I remember the day when I met you. Essential information, so defining, and additionally in defining relative clauses, using when, the when can be omitted. So you could also say, so I remember the day I met you. And this picture was taken yesterday when it was raining. This is adding extra information, so therefore it's a non-defining clause. Whom, for people as the object of a clause. This is mainly used in written English and is increasingly rare. For example, this is George, whom you met last year. And in a non-defining clause, this morning I met Charles, whom I hadn't seen for ages. Some relative pronouns can only be used in defining clauses. Why can only be used in a defining relative clause after the words the reason. So, for example, the film was the reason why he became famous. And like when, the relative pronoun why can be omitted in defining relative clauses. So you can also say the film was the reason he became famous. And you cannot use why in non-defining relative clauses. That can only be used in defining relative clauses to replace who, whom, or which. So you could say the picture which hangs on the wall, or also correct is the picture that hangs on the wall, or with who, the woman who he married, or the woman that he married. Or this is George, whom you met last year, or this is George, that you met last year. Equally correct. So you cannot use that in non-defining relative clauses. Next, who, which, or that can be omitted when they're the object of the clause. The medicine, which or that the doctor gave me, should be taken twice a day. Here the medicine is the object of the clause. The subject doing the action is the doctor. What did he give? The medicine, the object of the clause. So here you can leave out which or that and just say the medicine the doctor gave me should be taken twice a day. Whereas in non-defining clauses, you cannot leave out the relative pronoun. Both in defining and non-defining relative clauses, the relative pronoun can define the subject or the object of the verb. So firstly, in defining relative clauses, we have the picture which hangs on the wall is old. Here the relative pronoun which describes the subject of the sentence, the picture. And here the man who she married is Spanish, who is defining the object of the verb. In non-defining relative clauses, it's the same. In this sentence, the building, which is very old, needs repairing, which is defining the subject of the verb. And in this sentence, the boat owner, who we've just seen, loves meeting people, who defines the object of the verb. For both defining and non-defining relative clauses, we always omit the object pronoun, her, him, it, etc., when we make a relative clause. So you could say, we know little about the woman that he married, and not, we know little about the woman that he married her. Or, this picture shows Bob's wife Lucy, who he married in 2019, and not, this picture shows Bob's wife Lucy, who he married her in 2019. In both defining and non-defining relative clauses, you usually have the preposition at the end of the clause. So it's the one which he is responsible for at work. In a defining clause, and Sue, who my mother worked with, has become a teacher. In formal English, in both defining and non-defining relative clauses, you sometimes have a preposition at the beginning of the clause, followed by which for things or whom for people. So in defining relative clauses, you could say it's the one for which he was responsible at work, and in non-defining relative clauses, Sue, with whom my mother worked, has become a teacher. Also, in both defining and non-defining relative clauses, we cannot use that after a preposition in a relative clause. So you would say, the room in which the meeting was held was too small, and not the room in that the meeting was held was too small. And finally, defining relative clauses are used in writing and speaking, whereas non-defining relative clauses are more common in writing than in speaking. So now it's your turn. Choose the correct sentence between the two sentences given. Pause the video if you need to and think about the reasons why this is the case. 1. Have you ever been back to the town that you were born in? Notice the comma before the relative pronoun. Or, have you ever been back to the town you were born in? With no commas. The second sentence is correct. This is essential information. Otherwise, you would not know which town you are talking about. So it's a defining relative clause and therefore has no commas. 2. My left ankle, which I broke last winter, is still giving me trouble. Notice in the first sentence there are no commas and in the second there are. The correct sentence is the second one with the commas. Here the clause, which I broke last winter, is extra information and not essential to understanding the sentence. Therefore, it is a non-defining relative clause and needs commas. 3. The friend that I want to introduce you to is away this weekend. Or, the friend that I want to introduce you to her is away this weekend. Write your answer down below in the comment section and explain why this is the correct answer. And I promise to get back to you with feedback on how you've done. That's it for now. I hope you feel more confident using defining and non-defining clauses in English. Remember to like this video if you found it useful, share it with your friends and colleagues learning English. They'll thank you for it, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Oxford English Now, for more free English language videos. So take care, that's it for now, and see you very soon. Bye bye.